The autumn afternoon settled cold and clear over Seattle when the crowd outside Halcyon Motors fell silent, and in that silence stood a woman who had never once doubted she would win. Sloan Whitmore crossed her arms beside the matte black hypercar and let the smile rise slowly to her lips. Camera shutters cracked like distant gunfire. Investors leaned against the glass railing of the terrace above, champagne untouched in their hands. Reporters pressed against the velvet rope, and somewhere among them a live broadcast counted down the seconds before the most powerful electric vehicle company in America revealed the machine that would change everything. She had earned this moment through 11 years of refusing to stop. The press called her the Queen of Electric, and she had long stopped correcting them. Behind her, the ether gleamed under the falling sun, $1 million of carbon fiber and ambition, its battery promising a range no rival had matched. 300 people had come to watch her press a single button. Not one of them knew the button would fail. And not one of them, least of all Sloan herself, noticed the man at the far end of the lot. He stood beside an industrial generator with a wrench in one hand, and grease worked deep into the creases of his knuckles. His shirt was faded, but clean. His boots had been resoled more times than the leather wanted to admit. He was not on the guest list. He was not anyone the cameras would ever turn toward. He was simply the contractor hired to keep the exhibition power running, a quiet man named Elias Grant, watching the spectacle the way a person watches a storm gather over open water. What nobody in that crowd understood was that the silent man near the generators had once helped design the very battery hidden beneath the ether's flawless shell. The engineers who assembled it from old files had forgotten his name. The patents had passed through 3 corporate mergers. His work had become another company's triumph, and he had let it go, because grief teaches a person to stop counting what the world owes him. There was something else, too, a second secret, older than the first, buried so deep that even the woman about to humiliate him had spent 16 years failing to remember his face. She did not know the man she was about to mock had once reached into fire to pull her out of it. She did not know she had been quietly searching for him since she was 19 years old. Before this story goes any further, if you believe in kindness, in second chances, and in never measuring a human being by the dust on his clothes, take a moment to like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to the channel for more stories that remind us what we are capable of becoming. Because what happened that afternoon was never really about a car. It was about everything we choose not to see. Sloan lifted the microphone and thanked the investors who had believed in her. She thanked the engineers who had given 2 years of their lives to the machine behind her. She spoke of a future where the road belonged to everyone, and the crowd warmed to her, and the cameras drank in every confident word. Then she turned, and the moment she had rehearsed 1,000 times in her mind arrived at last. She walked to the driver's door. She lowered herself into the seat. She rested a single finger on the ignition. And in front of every camera broadcasting live across the country, Sloan Whitmore pressed the button. At the far end of the lot, where the applause arrived only as a muffled tide, Elias Grant tightened the final bolt on the generator housing and wiped his hands on a rag that had long since given up the color it was born with. The machine hummed back to life beneath his palm, steady, obedient, the way machines tended to be honest with him when people no longer were. He listened to it the way other men listen to music. A half-second of rhythm told him more than any diagnostic screen ever could. He was 38, though the years had pressed on him with the weight of more. His hands were a map of old labor, the knuckles thickened, a burn scar fading silver across the back of one wrist, the nails clean despite the grease, because he scrubbed them every night for a reason he never explained to anyone. There was a stillness in the way he worked that strangers sometimes mistook for slowness. It was not slowness. It was a man who had learned to spend his attention carefully, because attention was the only thing left that nobody could repossess. A few feet away, perched on an overturned tool crate, sat his reason for everything. Finn was 8 years old, small for his age, with a pencil clamped between his teeth and a worksheet balanced on one knee. His backpack, faded from blue to the color of an old sky, slumped against the crate beside him. From the side pocket, the corner of a small orange pill bottle caught the light, and Elias had positioned himself without thinking so that his own shadow fell across it. The boy worked through a column of subtraction, whispering each answer to himself before writing it down. And every so often his father glanced over, not to check the math, but simply to confirm that the boy was still there, still breathing, still his. That glance was a habit Elias had not been able to break in for years. Tucked behind the worn leather of his wallet, folded twice so the creases had gone soft, was a card from the children's clinic with the next appointment circled in red ink. He did not need to look at it. He knew the date the way he knew his own pulse. Behind them, the world Sloan Whitmore had built sparkled like something from another planet. Men in tailored suits checked their watches against the sun. Women in heels that had never touched a workshop floor laughed at jokes about quarterly returns. A drone lifted above the crowd to capture the hypercar from above, and the light it carried swept once across the parking lot before swinging back toward the stage, as if even the camera had decided there was nothing worth seeing on this end of the asphalt. Elias did not resent them. Resentment was a luxury, and he had sold every luxury he owned a long time ago. He simply did his work, kept his son fed, and asked the day for nothing it had not already promised him. That had become his entire definition of a good life, and on most days it was enough. "Dad," Finn said quietly, without looking up, "is that the most expensive car in the world?" "Close to it," Elias answered. "Have you ever driven one?" Elias almost smiled. "Something like it, a long time ago." The boy accepted this the way children accept the unverifiable kindnesses of their parents and returned to his subtraction. Elias coiled the last cable, latched the toolbox, and was reaching for his thermos when the sound from the stage changed. The applause faltered. The polished hum of a confident crowd cracked into something thinner, sharper, edged with confusion. A voice on the loudspeaker repeated an instruction that should not have needed repeating. Somewhere, a woman laughed nervously and stopped herself. Elias lifted his head and looked toward the car. What Elias saw when he lifted his head was a machine refusing to obey, and the sight pulled him backward through years he rarely allowed himself to enter. There had been a different version of him once. A younger man in a combat engineer's uniform, kneeling in foreign dirt, teaching a unit how to keep generators alive in heat that killed lesser equipment in hours. He had a gift for the language of machines, for the small failures hidden inside large systems, and when he left the service, that gift became a career. He joined a battery startup in its earliest days, back when the whole company fit inside a converted warehouse and ran on coffee and conviction. He designed the thermal management architecture that kept lithium cells from cooking themselves under load, the quiet skeleton that let a battery push hard without tearing itself apart. 3 patents carried his name. Engineers a decade older asked for his opinion. The future had felt like a road already paved. Then Lena began dropping things. A coffee mug, her car keys. Eventually the words for objects she had named 1,000 times. The diagnosis came with a number attached to it, and the number had too many zeros, and the insurance found its reasons to pay less than it promised. Elias left the work he loved without a second thought, because love had never required him to think twice. He sat in waiting rooms. He learned the chemistry of treatments the way he had once learned the chemistry of cells. He sold the house first, then the second car, then the watch she had given him, then the furniture, until the rooms echoed, and there was nothing left to sell but time. And he gave her all of that too. She died on a Tuesday morning while the rain wrote long lines down the hospital window. 4 months later, the company restructured, and his role dissolved into a reorganization chart he never bothered to read. There was a winter after that he did not speak of. A stretch of weeks when the truck cab was the only roof they had, when Finn slept across the bench seat under 3 coats and Elias kept the engine off to save fuel and held his son's feet in his hands through the cold. Then came the second terror, the one that still woke him at 3 in the morning, when Finn grew pale and bruised too easily, and a different ward with different machines became their whole world. The boy had survived it. The Bills had not died with the fear. They followed the two of them still, patient as shadows. And somewhere in those lost years, in a conference room Elias never entered. His thermal architecture had been bought, folded into a merger, polished by strangers, and laid quietly beneath the floor of a $1 million car. No record celebrated the man who drew the first lines. The triumph belonged now to people who had never met him. One of those people was standing on a stage 70 yards away, still holding her smile in place by force. Sloan had pressed the ignition, and the ether had answered with nothing. No hum, no light, no graceful surge of power. Only a silence so complete it seemed to spread outward into the crowd. She pressed it again. Nothing. Engineers in branded jackets rushed from the wings, tablets glowing, and began the frantic theater of competence. The electrical system read normal. The software reported no fault. The battery, they assured her in low voices, was fully charged and perfectly healthy. 10 minutes passed. The crowd's murmur thickened. 20 minutes. A reporter checked whether the live feed was still running. 30 minutes bled away under the lowering sun, and the cameras caught all of it. And slowly, for the first time in 11 years, the smile on Sloan Whitmore's face began to harden into something it had never worn in public before. The silence that had begun as suspense curdled now into something colder, and everyone on that lawn could feel it. Investors on the glass terrace set down their glasses and began murmuring the kind of arithmetic that ends careers. A reporter near the front whispered into her phone that the launch was, in her words, falling apart on live television. The engineers had stopped pretending. They huddled around an open service panel, trading blame in tight voices, while the sun dropped lower and the shadows of the crowd stretched long across the asphalt like accusations. Garrett Voss could not let it stand. The chief operating officer of Halcyon had built his entire reputation on rescuing rooms, and he understood that a humiliated audience will forgive almost anything except boredom. So he stepped to the edge of the stage, lifted a hand toward the far end of the lot, and reached for the oldest trick in the book. He found someone smaller to laugh at. "Well?" Voss said, his voice rolling out warm and theatrical across the speakers. "Maybe we've been overpaying our engineering department." He pointed, and 300 heads turned to follow his finger. "Perhaps the gentleman fixing our generators would like to take a look. He seems to understand machines better than the people we hired." The laughter came fast and grateful, the way laughter always does when a tense crowd is handed permission to release. Heads craned. Phones lifted. At the far edge of the parking lot, a man in a faded work shirt stood beside a toolbox with his son at his side, and suddenly the drone that had ignored him all afternoon swung its bright eye directly onto his face. Elias did not move. Beside him, Finn went very still, his pencil frozen above the worksheet. On the stage, Sloan Whitmore felt the laughter wash back toward her, and in it she heard her opening. A wounded animal does not stay wounded if it can make the crowd look elsewhere. She lifted the microphone she had nearly forgotten she was holding, and the confidence flooded back into her posture as if it had never left. "You know what?" she said, smiling now with teeth. "Let's make it interesting." The crowd leaned in. "Sir, at the back." "Yes, you?" Her voice carried, amplified, unmistakable. "If you can start this car, right here, in front of all these cameras, I will personally transfer $1 million to you before any of these people leave this lot." She let the number land. She let it shimmer. But if you can't, you'll admit to everyone watching that you came here looking for attention you didn't earn, and you'll collect your tools and leave the property. A sound went through the crowd that was half gasp, half delight. It was cruel, and it was irresistible, and that combination is the engine of every spectacle. Investors who had been calculating losses a minute earlier now grinned like children at a fair. The drone hovered closer. Somewhere a producer realized the broadcast had just become the most watched moment of the day and told everyone to keep rolling. To every single person on that lawn, the outcome was already written. On one side stood a billionaire who had reshaped an entire industry, flanked by a team of credentialed engineers and the most advanced vehicle her money could build. On the other stood a maintenance contractor with grease on his hands and a child clutching his sleeve. No one in that crowd believed for an instant that the man at the back of the lot knew more than the people who had built the car. The laughter settled into a hungry, expectant hush, and 300 faces turned, as one, toward Elias Grant. Elias did not look at the cameras. He looked down at his son. The humiliation itself meant nothing to him. He had been humiliated by waiting rooms and repossession notices, by the pity in the eyes of men who had once asked his opinion, by the cold of a truck cab on a January night. A crowd's laughter was a small thing next to those. He had survived worse with less. What he could not bear, the thing that closed around his chest like a hand, was the idea of Finn watching 300 strangers turn his father into a joke and carrying that image for the rest of his life. So he prepared to say no. He had the words ready, polite and final, the kind a man uses to close a door without slamming it. He would gather the toolbox, take his son's hand, and walk to the truck. And tomorrow this would be someone else's bad memory. Then he felt small fingers tighten around his. Finn was looking up at him, and there was no fear in the boy's face, only something steadier and far older than 8 years should allow. "Dad," he said, his voice low enough that only Elias could hear it under the noise of the crowd. "You always tell me that if I know something is right, I shouldn't be scared." The words landed exactly where the boy could not have known they would. They were Elias's own words, spoken across 100 bedtimes, repeated through chemotherapy and eviction, and every night the world had tried to teach his son to be afraid. Now they came back to him in a hospital-thin voice, offered as a gift, and there was nothing left in him that could refuse them. Elias set the toolbox down. He squeezed Finn's hand once, a promise without sound, and he began to walk. The crowd parted around him with the cruel curiosity of people expecting a fall. He felt the drone tracking him, felt the heat of 300 stairs, and he did not hurry. He climbed the short steps to the stage where the ether waited under the lights, and Garrett Voss smirked, and Sloan Whitmore folded her arms and prepared to watch the joke complete itself. But Elias did not lift the hood. He did nothing the crowd expected. Instead, he stood beside the driver's door, perfectly still, and he listened. He pressed the ignition once, not to start the car, but to hear what it would say. And in the soft electronic stutter that answered, in the precise way the dashboard woke and then hesitated, he heard a confession the engineers had been too loud to notice. He watched the diagnostic lights cycle through their sequence and read them the way another man might read a face. The years seemed to lift away from him as he worked, the exhaustion draining out of his features, replaced by a concentration so complete it transformed him. Then he straightened and spoke for the first time, his voice quiet but certain, carrying further than he intended, in the hush. "Cut the power. All of it. Main bus, auxiliary, everything. Leave it dark for 3 minutes." The engineers stared at him. One of them actually laughed. To shut down a vehicle in the middle of a launch, to deliberately blind every system they had been frantically reading, was the opposite of everything their training told them. Voss looked at Sloan. Sloan, intrigued despite herself, gave the smallest nod. The ether went dark. Elias crouched at the front of the car, and instead of reaching for the obvious panels, he slid his hand beneath the forward edge of the battery housing, down into a junction the engineers had never once thought to open, to a small cluster of connections buried where no one had thought to look. Down in the dark beneath the housing, Elias found what he had known would be waiting. It was not a broken part, nothing so loud as that. It was a single sensor in the thermal management chain, reporting a temperature that did not exist, a reading a fraction of a degree outside the range the safety system would tolerate. The car believed it was overheating in a place that was, in truth, perfectly cool, and so it had done exactly what he had designed it to do 16 years and 3 company names ago. It had refused to wake. The fault was subtle enough to slip past every modern diagnostic the engineers possessed because their software trusted the sensor's word over the laws of physics. But to the man who had drawn the original architecture, who had decided in the first place which lie the system should never tell, the error was as plain as a misspelled word in his own handwriting. He did not replace anything. He reseated a connector. That vibration had worked a hair loose, cleared the false reading, and walked the calibration sequence back to the baseline he had defined long before any of these people had heard the company's name. His hands moved without hesitation, each motion economical, certain, the muscle memory of a craftsman returning to a tool he had built himself. Then he closed the housing, wiped his palms once on his shirt, and stood. The entire lawn had gone silent. Even Voss had stopped smirking. The sun sat low and red behind the towers, and 300 people held a single breath. Elias opened the driver's door and lowered himself into the seat of the most expensive car he had ever touched, though once, long ago, he had touched the idea of it before it had a body. He rested one grease-darkened finger on the ignition. He did not pray. He simply knew. He pressed the button. For one suspended heartbeat, the silence held, and the crowd braced for the failure they had paid to see. Then the ether came alive. The electric drive woke with a sound like a held note, resolving, smooth, deep, flawless, the power building in a seamless surge that rolled through the chassis and out across the lawn. The dashboard bloomed into light. Every system that had been dead for 40 minutes rose at once, healthy and humming, and the machine that had embarrassed a billionaire on live television now purred beneath the hands of the man in the faded shirt, as though it had been waiting for him all along. The crowd detonated. The sound was enormous, disbelieving, a roar of 300 voices breaking at once. Investors who had been drafting their exits surged to their feet on the terrace, applauding with the desperate gratitude of people whose money had just been saved. Reporters shouted questions no one could hear. The engineers stood frozen, staring at the dashboard, then at the man, then at each other. And Finn ran. He came across the lawn at a full sprint, weaving past suits and cables, and threw himself against his father's chest the instant Elias stepped out of the car. The boy's arms locked around him, and his face was wet and shining, and for the first time in 4 years, he watched the whole world see what he had always known lived inside his father. But on the stage, no one was celebrating. A senior engineer had crossed quietly to Sloan, a tablet held low between them, and on its screen glowed a scanned archival document, yellowed at the edges, recovered from a merger long buried in the company's files. Across the top of the original design schematics, repeated on filing after filing, signed in a hand she did not yet recognize, was a single name: Elias Grant. The smile died on Sloan Whitmore's face, but the name on the tablet was not what struck her hardest. It was only the first blow. The second came a moment later, and it came without warning. Elias had bent to return Finn's embrace, and as he straightened, he reached up to shield his eyes against the low red sun. The motion pushed back the worn cuff of his left sleeve, and the dying light fell across the inside of his forearm, where a long scar ran from wrist to elbow, old and silver and shaped like something that had once been burned. Sloane saw it, and the world tilted. She knew that scar. She had never known the face above it, never the name, never the voice, but she knew that scar, the way a person knows the shape of their own salvation. For 16 years it had lived in the place where her nightmares met her gratitude, and seeing it now in the ordinary autumn light, tore open a door she had spent half her life unable to close. She was 19 again, a mountain road near Olympic National Park, late and unlit, the kind of curve that punishes a single careless second. Her car leaving the asphalt. The long, sickening roll down the slope, metal folding around her, the windshield filling with sky, and then earth, and then sky again. The terrible stillness afterward, the smell of fuel. Then the first orange light licking up from beneath the hood, and the realization, cold and complete, that the doors would not open, and the phone in her hand had no signal, and no one was coming. Cars had slowed on the road above. She remembered the faces at the railing, pale ovals looking down, none of them willing to come closer as the fire grew. She had screamed until her voice gave out, and the heat had reached her legs, and she had begun, at 19, to make her peace with the end. And then someone had come down the slope. A young man, a delivery driver who had pulled his van to the shoulder, half sliding through the brush. She remembered almost nothing of his features, only the focus in them, the absence of panic. He had found a length of steel somewhere, a bar pried from the wreck of the guardrail, and he had wedged it into the buckled door and pulled against the fire until the metal screamed and gave. The flames had caught his arm as he reached in for her. He had not stopped. He had dragged her up the slope by the collar and the wrist, his sleeve smoking, and laid her in the wet grass an instant before the fuel tank let go behind them with a sound like the end of the world. When the ambulance arrived, its lights spinning red against the trees, she had turned her head to thank him. He was already gone. No name, no number. Only tire tracks on the shoulder and a stranger's blood on her sleeve. For 16 years she had carried him with her, this unpaid debt, this faceless man who had walked into fire for a girl he would never see again, and asked for nothing, not even to be remembered. She had built an empire, and somewhere underneath all of it had always been the quiet ache of a thank you she had never been allowed to say. Now she stood on a stage above a cheering crowd, and the man she had just mocked before 300 people, the man she had bet $1 million could not even start a car, lifted his scarred arm into the light, and she understood. The applause went on roaring around her. Sloane Whitmore did not hear a sound of it. She stood perfectly still, the microphone slack in her hand, staring at a stranger she had spent 16 years trying to find. Sloane set the microphone down on the hood of the car. She did not reach for an explanation, did not turn to her team, did not glance at the cameras that had recorded every second of her cruelty. She simply walked down the steps of the stage, across the lawn she had ruled an hour before, until she stood in front of a man in a faded shirt with his son's hand in his. Then, in front of every employee, every shareholder, every reporter still broadcasting live, she bowed her head. "I'm sorry," she said. The words were quiet, but the silence had grown so deep that they carried to the back of the lot. "I'm sorry for what I said to you. I'm sorry for what I made these people laugh at." Her voice did not break, but something behind it had. "And I'm sorry for something you don't even know about yet." She was not apologizing because the broadcast demanded it, though it did. She was not apologizing to repair a launch or rescue a stock price, though both now hung on what she said next. She was apologizing because, for the first time in more years than she could count, she had seen herself clearly, and she could not stand what she saw. Inside her, something fundamental was coming apart. For 11 years she had built a private religion out of appearances, a faith that the world arranged itself fairly, that the people at the top had climbed there, and the people at the bottom had stayed there for reasons that made sense. It was a comfortable belief. It let her mock a man in greasy boots without ever wondering what those boots had walked through. And now that entire architecture was collapsing inside her at once, because the man she had measured by his clothes had designed the heart of her empire, had carried her out of fire, had been quietly building the foundation beneath her feet, while she stood on it and laughed. She turned to her chief financial officer, who hovered nearby, ashen. "Transfer it, now, the full amount, while everyone is still standing here." There was no negotiation, no contract, no lawyer slowing it down. Within minutes, on a phone held up so the cameras could see the screen, $1 million moved from Halcyon Motors into the account of a maintenance contractor who had come to work that morning unsure whether the day's wages would cover the week. Elias watched the number appear and felt nothing he had expected to feel. He had not done it for the money. He had done it because his son had reminded him not to be afraid. By midnight, the world had decided the story belonged to it. The footage spread the way only certain things spread, leaping from feed to feed, from country to country, faster than any press release Sloan had ever paid for. But the millions who watched it did not stop for the car. The hypercar was forgotten within the hour. What held them, what made strangers weep at their kitchen tables and share the video with people they had not spoken to in years, was the single father in the Risold boots who had refused to let the worst years of his life decide who he was. They saw a man the world had overlooked, and they recognized in him every overlooked person they had ever loved. The next morning, Elias woke in the small rented room he shared with Finn to a phone that would not stop ringing. Universities, corporations, reporters, a talk show, a car company offering a title he had once dreamed of holding. Opportunity arrived from every direction at once, more than he had dared hope for in 4 years of going without. But Elias did not think about any of it. He sat on the edge of the bed, listened to his son breathing in the next bed over, and thought only of one small, simple thing. The simple thing he thought about was a kitchen, a real one with a window where a boy could do his homework at a table that belonged to him. When Sloan came to see him 3 days later, she came alone, without cameras or handlers, the way a person comes when they finally mean it. She found Elias on the steps of his rented room, and she expected, perhaps, that he would ask for more. Most people did. Instead, he told her something that rearranged her a second time. "I took the money," he said, "but I want you to understand. I never needed $1 million to know what I'm worth. I knew that before any of this." He kept only what a man should keep. Enough to put down roots in a small house with a yard, the kind he and Lena had once circled in real estate listings before the listings became hospital invoices. Enough to open a college fund for Finn so the boy's future would never again depend on a stranger's wager. Enough, finally, to erase the last of the medical debt that had trailed them like a shadow through every cold winter. The bills from Lena's long dying and from the ward where Finn had nearly followed her. For the first time in 4 years, the arithmetic of his life came out to 0, and 0 felt like wealth. The rest, the great remaining bulk of it, he did not want for himself. "There are other men out there like me," he told her, fathers who lost the person they loved and then lost everything else trying to hold on. Nobody sees them. I want to build something that does. He proposed it plainly, the way he proposed solutions to broken machines. A foundation, job training for men starting over with nothing, help finding steady work that could survive a sick child and a hard month, scholarships for the children so that grief would never again decide what a kid was allowed to become. He asked Sloan to build it with him, not to fund it from a distance, but to put her name and her hands into it. He wanted to call it the Lighthouse Foundation. Sloan did not answer right away because she could not trust her voice. When she could, she told him she would do more than fund it. She committed a fixed share of Halcyon's annual profit to the foundation in perpetuity, written into the company's charter where no future board could quietly delete it. The debt she owed this man could never be paid in a single transfer, so she chose to keep paying it for the rest of her life. A year passed. The Lighthouse Foundation opened offices in 3 cities, and by its first anniversary, it had reached hundreds of single-parent families, men and women alike, who had been one bad month from collapse. Some learned a trade, some found work. Their children opened acceptance letters at kitchen tables. The story that had begun as a cruel bet on a parking lot had become, quietly, a machine for second chances, and it ran the way the best machines do, without needing anyone to watch it. Halcyon offered Elias a seat on its executive board. They offered it more than once with titles and stock and a corner office overlooking the water. He declined every time, gently, without resentment. He agreed only to serve as an independent technical advisor, work he could do on his own hours, because his hours now belonged to something he refused to sell again. He drove Finn to school every morning. He stood behind the backstop at Little League games and shouted himself hoarse. He cooked dinner in the kitchen with the window. He built, at last, the ordinary, quiet life that the loud years had stolen from him. And one evening, as autumn came around again, he took his son down to the Seattle waterfront to watch the light leave the sky. The water moved slow and dark below the pier, scattering the city's lights into long ribbons of gold across its surface. Finn sat beside his father, with his legs swinging over the edge, the way only children can sit above deep water without fear, and for a while neither of them spoke. The ferries crossed in the distance. The cold came up gently off the sound. Then the boy asked the question he had been holding for a year. "Dad," he said, "do you ever wish you hadn't saved her?" Elias did not answer quickly. He looked out at the water, at the way the light kept finding its way back across the dark, and he thought about the mountain road and the fire and the woman who had once laughed at him and then bowed her head before a crowd. He thought about all the years in between, the cold ones and the frightening ones, the years no amount of money could give back. "No," he said at last, "if I had known that day that she would grow up to hurt me one afternoon in a parking lot, I still would have gone down that slope. I would have done exactly the same thing." Finn turned to look at him. "Because kindness isn't a trade," Elias said. "It doesn't depend on what the other person does with it later. You don't reach into the fire because you expect something back. You reach in because someone is burning, and you can. That's all. That's the whole of it." The boy was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded, slowly, the way a person nods when something has settled into a place inside them that it will never leave. Far out across the water, the lighthouses had begun their work, turning their patient beams through the gathering dark. Elias watched them and thought that this was the truest thing he knew. A lighthouse asks nothing of the ships it saves. It does not check who is worthy before it shines. Real kindness is the same. It can stand in the dark for years with no one watching, no one thanking it, no one even knowing it is there. And then one day, without warning, its light reaches all the way back to the one who first lit it and guides them home. The man the world had overlooked sat with his son above the glittering water, and he was at last exactly where he belonged. If there is one thing to carry away from this story, let it be this: never measure a person by where they happen to be standing today. You cannot see the battles they have survived. You cannot see the dreams they have set down so that someone they love could keep going. The quiet man at the edge of the crowd may be the one who built the very ground beneath your feet, and the stranger you overlook may be the one who once carried you out of the fire. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone in your own life who kept going when the world stopped watching, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel, to like this video, and to share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Your support is what allows us to keep bringing you stories like this one every single day. And now we would love to hear from you. Has a stranger ever helped you when you had no way to repay them? Someone you never got the chance to thank? How did this story make you feel, and where does it touch your own life? Tell us in the comments below. We read them and we listen, because the feelings you carry in your heart are the reason these stories exist at all. Thank you for spending this time with us. May you be healthy, may your days be peaceful, and may your life be full of quiet, ordinary joy. Take good care of yourself and the people you love. Goodbye for now, and we will see you again in the next video.